Last year I got this 1951 BMW R25 up and running, and many of you really enjoyed that video. Although I managed to get it up and running, it wasn't running quite right, and there were some hidden issues I hadn't mentioned. Right now my biggest concern is the engine, so let's dig in, figure out what's causing the problem, and determine the necessary repairs. The last time I started the BMW R25 engine, I noticed an issue with one of the push rods. As you can see here, the exhaust push rod is rotating as it should, but the intake push rod is not moving at all. I suspect the cam follower has an issue, so let's find out. To get to the engine, I basically have to strip down all major components, including the fuel tank, the bin carburetor, and the exhaust pipe, which I didn't remove during the initial startup. Just check out what I found inside. Looks like I might have to get a new exhaust system. If anyone has one laying around, let me know. Next, I'll take off the rear wheel, and then it's time to remove the final drive and the gearbox as well. Finally, I can focus on getting the 250cc engine out of the frame. A huge shout out to CRC for letting me test their products like the knocker loose penetrating fluid. This stuff is game changer for loosening bolts that have been in place for decades. The BMW R25 engines are solidly mounted to the frame, which is why the frames tend to vibrate a little bit more during the rides. By loosening just 2 large bolts and nuts, the engine was free from the frame. I used a piece of wood underneath to support the engine before lifting it out. I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit awkward, and while it's not really heavy, about 30 kilos or about 70 pounds, I didn't want to risk dropping or damaging anything. At this point, the engine's top end has been rebuilt as shown in the last video just to get it up and running. But what does the bottom end look like? Well, it's time to dive in and see. I've set up a custom engine mounting stand for this BMW single-cylinder engine. This allows full access to all sides with the ability to pivot in 4 locations. Earlier I noticed the intake push rod wasn't rotating, so whatever's causing that issue is likely below the cylinder head. So let's start off by removing the valve covers, the rocker arms, and the rebuilt cylinder head. Looking at the piston, it's clear that the engine had enough oil while running, and there's no major damage to be seen, but let's keep going to be sure. Next, I'll remove the cylinder jug to reveal the Neural 4-ring piston, which looks to be in decent condition. The cylinder bore is well oiled with no major flaws, though it's shiny, being most likely glazed, a topic for another day. Now let's take out the camshaft followers. These parts center the push rods and transmit motion through the push rods, which eventually activate the rocker arms. Upon examining the surfaces that interacts with the camshaft more closely, I noticed something really concerning, and it doesn't end here. So let's continue by removing the wrist pin with some heat and a socket. This reveals the connecting rod bushing, which looks relatively healthy. With everything removed from the top end, it's time to dive into the front end of the engine where all the electrical components are housed. The nuts and bolts are all rusted, so I apply a little bit of CRC penetrating fluid to make the removal easier. As bad as it looks, this rust actually allowed the bike to run. That's really impressive if you ask me for a 74-year-old electrical system. Now I'll remove the main electrical components, including the ignition coil, the points, the condenser, and the stator, which is directly attached to the timing cover. Once removed, we get a look at the stator coils along with the rotor tightly connected to the crankshaft. This assembly makes up the alternator, and the rotor needs to be carefully extracted from the crankshaft. Next, I'll remove the timing cover to expose the timing components. On the bottom left, you can see the crankshaft connected to the camshaft above, linked by a simplex timing chain. No tensioner here to be seen, that was introduced on the R25/2 or a later model. After removing the engine breather and timing chain, we can take out the camshaft from the engine block. The front bearing looks pretty good, but the rear bearing could definitely use some attention. I'm glad I took this engine apart when I did, as this needs replacing. Finally, I'll remove the crankshaft timing sprocket, and then we can rotate the engine to start working on the clutch side of things. 3 bolts secure the clutch assembly, which consists of the compression ring, the clutch fiber plate, and the pressure plate. To release the spring tension, I'm using longer bolts to back the assembly off gradually. This reveals something quite fascinating, a unique flywheel design featuring 3 coil springs. This setup was first introduced on the BMW R24 in 1949 and only remained in production for about 4 years. Next, it's time to figure out how to remove the nut securing the flywheel to the crankshaft. Here, I got a little bit creative. I used a 7/8 inch socket and a flat stock bar fixed to the engine mounting stand as a makeshift tool. Surprisingly, the nut wasn't very tight, which also raises concerns, and my unconventional fixture worked like a charm, so maybe you can try it out for yourself. Now onto removing the flywheel itself. Using a flange puller and 2 M10 bolts, I reversed the fixture's orientation and it worked perfectly as well. With the flywheel removed, I could see the rear main oil seal that had been leaking slightly, but it wasn't as bad as I feared. Next, I pivoted the engine on the stand to remove the front main bearing carrier. A bit of heat helped expand the engine block, making the process smooth with the puller setup. Although I could have tackled the oil pan earlier, I saved it for last. Sometimes you've got to leave exciting bits for later. I'm extremely glad I didn't run this engine any longer. Just look at the state of it. Have you ever seen anything like this? After a quick cleanup, I removed the oil pickup strainer and the oil pump. Then it was time to address the crankshaft. Once again, I positioned the engine block on its side and heated the area around the rear main bearing. Heating allows the engine block to expand, which makes removing the crankshaft much easier without damaging the housing. This engine dissipates heat really well, so I had to work quickly. At around 80 degrees Celsius, I used a slide hammer to carefully extract the crankshaft vertically. With the bearing free, the crankshaft came out at an angle relatively easily. Next was the slinger, which acts as the engine's oil filter. Over the years, it had accumulated grime from the contaminants and the oil breakdown. BMW recommends cleaning the slinger every 5,000 kilometers or roughly 3,000 miles. Instead of replacing a cartridge filter, however, this engine requires a full disassembly. This slinger is well packed with grime, a testament to why classic engines should be inspected before being put back into use, especially on a BMW. I then extracted the oil seal which rides on the flywheel using a drift tool, which incredibly is still the original version. After that, I removed the chrome pushrod tube from the engine block, officially concluding the disassembly. A full detailed disassembly video is just around the corner, so stay tuned for that. Now let's go over the components that need attention, either for repair or replacement. Let's talk about the oil slinger. This was the primary reason for tearing down the engine. If grime builds up excessively, it can clog oil passageways, leading to catastrophic failures. If you own a pre-1970s BMW and have one of these in your engine, it might be worth checking it out. Secondly, the timing components. This includes the sprockets and timing chain. Even with just 12 horsepower, worn rotating parts like a chain with 91,000 kilometers of use are a failure point. It's worth replacing parts as needed. Next, the lubrication system. I noticed the oil pressure was somewhat low as well. Starting with the oil pickup strainer, I'll carefully inspect the entire system and take on repairs as needed. The lubrication system is the engine's core, providing oil to all moving parts while also cooling the engine from the inside. We also have to talk about the bearings. While all bearings were functional, some like the rear camshaft bearing were nearly at the end of their lifespan. A failure here could destroy internal components and worst of all, damage the engine block. That would be a nightmare to repair. Now lastly, the cam follower on the intake side. At the start of this video, you saw that the cam follower on the intake side wasn't rotating. That's because the intake cam follower had worn a pattern on its surface, preventing rotation. Fortunately, the camshaft itself wasn't affected, but if left unchecked, this issue could have caused severe internal damage. Luckily, that did not happen. Now you've seen what lies ahead of me, a collection of parts laid out on this table ready for a deep clean. After that, I will inspect and precisely measure all the components to verify them with the factory specifications. Then I can figure out if I will repair them or if it's just cheaper to replace them. And if you have any recommendations or questions about anything that I spoke about in today's video, feel free to leave a comment down below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because it is free and it also helps this channel grow. In my upcoming video, I will share a detailed disassembly video of this BMW R25 engine. So if you guys need any tools or if you guys would like to know the bolt sizes of something that I'm removing, that will be all featured in the upcoming video, and I hope you guys are looking forward to that just as much as me. If you want to see more BMW R25 related content, click this playlist right here where you can find all the videos that I've uploaded, and in the near future, I'll be uploading many more. So thank you so much for watching.